My name is Rowan Conway. I am Director of Research and Innovation at the RSA. I'd just like to sort of get a sense check of the room of how many of you have heard of the Royal Society of Arts. Oh, good, excellent. So you know where I'm coming from. Sometimes that can take the whole 20 minutes that I'm going to talk just to try and explain what we do. So Ian is a fellow of the RSA, and we had been having some discussions about this event and how this event might align with some of the work that we're doing at the RSA and with Nesta around a model of change called Health as a Social Movement. I'm really interested to build on what happened yesterday and then also what happened in the panel earlier, because I think it might give a bit of a sense of what I will try and talk about here. So I'm going to try and talk about the potential of social movements to foster the conditions for change. But just stepping back a little bit of the way that we think about change at the RSA is that building on sort of cultural theory, there are different levers for change, different things that inspire change, some of which are hierarchical or technocratic. Now, I think yesterday you will have discussed some of the technical things that you can do or you can apply to make for the change that you're looking for neighbourhoods for the future. Some of which are individualistic, and I think that was very interesting listening to some of the positive psychology things, talking about what it is to be an individual in an ageing society, how you retain sort of colourful, technicolor lives. I think you were talking about how you retain a thriving old age, that you have individual purpose, that you feel connected to your life, and you avoid social isolation. But there is a third tier, and I think it's actually probably the middle tier, which is the social community and the solidaristic model of change. And so what we're looking at here is actually how you galvanise community, how you inspire change through connections to your community. So some of the things that I'll talk about here may not be directly of relevance to how you design neighbourhoods for the future, but this will straddle a tea break, this session, so I'm going to do a short presentation about case studies around what social movements are, and then for the purposes of the framework, what we'll do is we'll go out and have a cup of tea, and while we go out and have a cup of tea, I'll prep some of those flip charts and you can start thinking about the social movement needs that might facilitate this kind of change. So that can then feed back into the framework. So we've talked about positive psychology and the things that the individual needs to do. We've talked a lot about the technology, and you had a lot of live labs yesterday where you talked about what are the things you need to do, what are the innovations that need to be made. But actually now I'm trying to bring this all together to think societally, what are the social conditions for making this change happen? I don't know how to move my slides on, which is an interesting thing. Do I just wave at you? Oh, next. Sorry, that was just a very... Yeah, there you go. Did that move on? So, as Ian said, we're doing a piece of work with Nesta. We are, with Nesta and the Health Lab, working together as national partners with NHS England on a programme that is exploring health as a social movement. We are very, very early in this programme. So this is a 3-year programme thinking about how the vanguards can think differently about making social change. So vanguards, if many of you will know, are different new care models, so new innovations for the healthcare system that are going to try and be bedded back into the programme after their 3 years, or they're trialling right now. Now, we're working with the vanguards to explore what the conditions are to help them go viral, if you like, or some of these have got particular community biases. So multi-speciality and community care models are looking at how you engage with communities to improve health. So we're exploring how to mobilise citizens to lead social action for health. And we're looking at what social models are. So this is social movements for health models are. So I will talk about those conditions, but I'm interested, as this will be a hierarchical thing, an interactive session, I'm interested to try and draw from this group your sense of what social movements, when you think about, I'll give you the answer. I'm going to ask you, I think we might have the slightly wrong slides, but that's okay. So, wing it. Sense of what do you think of when you think about the term social movement? Does anything spring to mind immediately? Vision for change. Think of anything that's happening right now. Is there anything right now that you would categorise as social movement? Brexit, yeah, Brexit, social movement, galvanising people's passions, solidarity.
Grassroots innovation?
Yeah, so grassroots innovation can be about how you make change from the bottom up. Vegetarianism is possibly something that made its way via social movements into the mainstream, yeah. Probably quite a long time ago, but yeah.
Slow food.
Sorry? Slow food, yeah, absolutely. That's a social movement.
Effective altruism.
Sorry?
Effective altruism.
Effective altruism? I'm not sure. Crowdfunding, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly, 38 degrees, those kinds of quick mobilisation of issues-led petitions.
Also,
Yeah.
like Airbnb, just share.
Yeah, this shows you how flexible the concept of a social movement is, because you can think of it as diverse as vegetarianism or the sharing economy or the Arab Spring or Brexit or junior doctors strike. You know, what is it that's mobilising social causes through community engagement and galvanisation? And this is very much not about the hierarchy, which is why it's very interesting to explore this with NHS England, because it's not about a cascade of new models. It's actually about trying to see where is the passion and essence within a new model of care that will actually mobilise itself. So they do have a term that describes what NHS Institute of Innovation sees as a social movement, which they have down as a voluntary collective of individuals committed to promoting or resisting change through a coordinated activity to produce a lasting and self-generating effect and creating, as they do, a shared sense of identity. So there are social movements throughout history, and I think vegetarianism is a really good one, actually, because it illustrates how things become mainstreamed. There is a life cycle of a movement where you are trying to affect change. And so you can see that with a variety of different things. So this is an example of the women's movement, explaining how civic action was a movement of a group of people with a shared purpose. I don't know if you would have heard the very famous phrase by Margaret Wheatley, never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. We often talk about that at the RSA, and because the RSA is a fellowship of 27,000 people. So to a certain degree, we see ourselves as powering not necessarily a single movement, because it's about social change in its own right, but actually powering innovation and new ideas. But there are some key components within social movements. So this is the substance of a conversation with anyone who is trying to scale or replicate innovation in a system, is to think that actually it can't be commanded, it can't be commandeered, you can't co-opt a social movement. It's not necessarily entirely grassroots. Certainly the system can put forward political goals. So, Jeremy Corbyn's ascent to the leadership of the Labour Party could be seen as a social movement, but certainly he put forward a proposition that then galvanised activity. So there is a strong demand for leadership for a social movement. Social movements won't start unless there is something that generates that momentum. But then political goals or plans emerge that come out of that, and then organising is what is a principle of what will actually mobilise. So community organising, I think, in the Obama campaign was very much, in the first Obama campaign, was very much credited as powering a social movement that underpinned that change in government. You could probably say the same for Trump right now, actually, too, which is quite interesting. So there are a combination of strategies that support the social movement, and interestingly, as you point to, some of these are much more fast-paced than they ever were before. So 38 degrees, those kinds of petition-led movements and social media are enabling social movements to gain much greater and faster pace. So, I see that I can actually look at my slides here if I move this very large document. So in our work that as I say, we're about 6 months into this project that we're working on with Nesta. We've been looking specifically in how to power change in health and healthcare services specifically. And so we've thought about types of health-driven social movements. Now, this won't necessarily be fully applicable for ageing, but part of the dialogue that we want to have after this session is to think about what are the types of social movements that might power for a change in the way that neighbourhoods are designed and developed for an ageing population. But there are sort of three kinds of types of social movements for health. The first one being access and provision movements. So that would be about seeking equitable access to healthcare, improved provision of healthcare services. I would categorise that kind as a sort of the disability, I think you referred to the disability and independent living movement, which is trying to drive change. So it's a proactive thing. It's not reacting, it's proactive. It's seeing that there's a problem, it was creating a solution and providing proactive momentum to make that happen. So examples would be identifying that there's a need to get a wider cohort of people who are uninsured to be insured, and then mobilising and providing ideas to galvanise around. Disease, disability and illness movements, challenging science on, I don't know how to say this word, etiology, this diagnosis, treatment and prevention. These may include constituents who are not ill but who perceive themselves as vulnerable to disease, like the breast cancer movement and the AIDS movement. Again, that is reactive against the system but proactive to drive change. So it's possibly reactive against what the current situation is, but provides positive models of change that then galvanise people to move through it. And I will take us through a couple of case studies around that. And inequality and equity movements, which are particularly reactive against the system or reactive against change. So they are based on a perceived inequity, and so they're driven based on injustice, if you like, and the sense to ensure that equality is moved. So the women's health movement is one way of looking at that. So I'm going to run through a few case studies, and I know I'm going to try and wrap up this session at 11 so that we can then go and have a cup of tea and have a chat about it. But I'm going to whip through quite a few diverse case studies. And they're diverse because there aren't any definitive answers about what constitutes a social movement. There are a range of, these are my old slides. I don't know how I did that. Oh, well, that's fine. I'm going to, I did have one about the junior doctors in here, but it's gone. And the junior doctors case study is interesting purely because it's an illustration of reacting against the system. So it's challenging the system and then galvanizing public support. So that's a really interesting one when we're trying to think about mobilizing health as a social movement in health behaviors, because actually there are resistances that come from resisting the hierarchy. So going back to that original model of change where you have the hierarchy, the solidaristic or the community, and then the individual. If actually individuals are choosing to support something that's resisting the institution, i.e. junior doctor strike is resisting NHS England's proposed changes, is then maybe difficult to try and mobilise a more community-led health process at the same time, because you have conflicting things in the public domain. It gets quite complicated. Oh, I didn't do that. Is that fine? Okay. Am I in charge again? Oh, there you go. Thanks. I mean, this is just the data on the junior doctor strike. Effectively, I think the key issues there is that it's become incredibly political, and 57% of public support for the strike is not really something that is kind of unprecedented in recent times, and so it's changing our political landscape in quite an interesting way. ACT UP, US AIDS activism. This was a protest movement that successfully argued that clinical trials are a form of healthcare, specifically in the US, but it promoted awareness of AIDS in the face of quite a strong stigma and silence, specifically actually with women. And there was inaccurate data that was leading some of the healthcare trials because there wasn't enough diagnosis. So and there was a sort of a culture of silence. And in the first 5 years of AIDS, 40,000 people died, and the president never said the word AIDS. So this campaign, ACT UP, directly targeted the regulation and design of clinical trials to speed up access to AIDS drugs. And you could say, looking 30 years on, that it's really bedded in new understanding of the condition, but also the whole how to approach stigma in long-term conditions. Now, NHS Change Day was the first time that NHS England actually attempted to try and use social movement theory internally, because I'm not sure who alluded to the workforce, but the 1 in 8 of the UK population working for the NHS is quite a lot of people. And so trying to embed positive behaviour change as seeding it from the sort of solidarity of being an NHS employee was something that Helen Bevan, who sits in the innovation unit at NHS England, decided that she really wanted to test in 2009. So it was something that actually emerged out of a grassroots. So it wasn't actually a cascaded hierarchical idea, but it was something that was observed and then actually has really improved over time or doubled in numbers over time. So it was started by a group of young doctors in the leadership course who got talking about frustrations of driving positive change. And this was very much about positive mindsets in the NHS, and asked anyone who engages with the NHS to publicly pledge to make a change for the better and then share what they've done to inspire others. In the space of a few months, a conversation between young doctors and improvement leaders turned into an online social movement that captured nearly 200,000 pledges to make a positive difference in services. And it's run annually since. Now, in the second year, it went up to 500,000. And it was things like commitments to saying, I will help people who look lost in the corridor, and just getting a sense of this is a community and this is something that we want to not just say, this is what I do, I only work in my narrow and isolated role, but actually we are part of a community of people who work at NHS England. As employees, we want to see a movement for change. So it wasn't about structural change, it was about social change. Now, quantified self, I think, is quite interesting because this is where you start getting into the potential of all that tech chat that you had yesterday and how it might move over the generations as the more and more people adopt the kind of app technology that is ubiquitous. Now, I know you had a session on the Internet of Things yesterday and how actually you might be able to have incredibly smart homes. There is a generational evolution, if you like, into people who will have grown up with this kind of technology. So this idea of intergenerational homes, I think, will become much easier as we bridge that tech-savvy gap. That's not to say I am not casting any aspersions on people not being able to understand tech who are in later life. There is just such a great acceleration of change in the technical landscape right now. So quantified self is it's a growing trend of capturing data, this kind of stuff, walking around, have I done 10,000 steps today? Often, but not always related to health. I can check my heart rate on this, but there are things about personal life, so Mindspace or Headspace, apps that help you, Big White Wall, which is mental health app and website, which enables people to share mental health stories. Things like Runkeeper, I have it on my phone, I have it on my wrist, I have it on my Facebook, and I'm able to start showing that my health behaviours are improving my life. So involvement ranges from tracking diet and exercise routines, so MyFitnessPal, those kinds of things really can create their own movements in their own right. They become communities. I always find it a little bit terrifying when MyFitnessPal says, do you want to make friends with all these other people who are doing stuff? No, I don't want them to know what I had for dinner. But I know that some people will want to do that. Mumsnet is a really good example of how people do come together to share about improving their lives. And in quantified self, we're talking about improving their health. There is a growing market of apps, and with the Internet of Things, there will be a real ability to move this kind of social movement and the adoption of increasingly complex biometric tools and biometric data. So it's moving into a kind of personal accountability for my health based on the fact that I have my data. And then that, I'm really excited for how this works. We're seeing that Fitbits have, really taken off. 20 million devices already sold, and 6.9 million users paying to pair additional devices, so these two things being paired. That's an unusual kind of social movement because it's kind of silent. It's not something where we're really, we're marching in the streets, but we are seeing that this is a social media-led, and tech-enabled movement. I think breast cancer awareness probably speaks for itself. It's effectively the advocacy that grew out of women's health movements. And I think it plays to that same point about, some of this is campaign strategy. So the pink ribbon of the breast cancer awareness is something that then became ubiquitous, and this is what, similarly with the red ribbon with AIDS, that actually I am supporting this cause. And these things have very, very long lifetimes now. So this is now over 30 years that people have been trying to continue to raise awareness for breast cancer, and the idea being that you are galvanising social movements around it. So Cancer Research UK will focus on the kind of think pink type strategies and bring together this movement of people who are very committed because they have probably experienced someone in their lives who has been affected by breast cancer. And then I'm just going to talk about one social enterprise here and how a social movement can actually be founded for health, specifically through the kind of individual entrepreneur or the individual social entrepreneur. So this was effectively, Mark Swift was an NHS employee who was working on mental health and prevention, but he effectively saw that the community had so much more to offer in terms of health, community health and mental well-being, that he wanted to create a sort of evidence, he wanted to work in the community and create a system where he could work more directly with a wider cohort. So he created, their approach is One Halton, built on the belief that open innovation community is key to driving social movement in health. Over the last 10 years, they've helped 14,000 people achieve healthier lives. 74% who are part of the programme report leading happier lives, with a series of different kinds of interventions that are co-produced among the community. So it's an opt-in community, people co-produce their solutions and then they kind of mobilise thereafter. People make well-being pledges publicly, and then they've delivered over 550 well-being projects. They are now linking back to 17 GP practices to help strengthen actually some of the NHS practices, but he felt that he had to do this outside as an entrepreneur rather than something that he could do as an intrapreneur, if you like, within NHS England. It's now working with over 500 partners across the UK. So it shows that there's a sort of sense that a movement can come out of social innovation. And finally, this is actually a Power to Change. We're also a partner with Power to Change, which is a community business a community business accelerator that is powered by Big Lottery or funded by Big Lottery. And it's about how communities can accelerate business for their own benefits. And I just think Granby 4 Streets, which I won't have time to show this short film, but is an interesting piece just to think about in the context of actually neighbourhood renewal. So if we're not thinking about neighbourhood renewal purely in a hierarchical way, so the framework says we have a master plan, we'll deliver this number of homes, they're going to look like this, but actually what does it take if you bring and galvanise community to really build what they want? And local residents in Granby and Liverpool have done that by transforming 4 streets after years of failed regeneration, which were effectively derelict but beautiful Victorian houses, but had been derelict for many years, and were primed to be knocked down. But they attracted enough of they painted them in a really interesting, loads of murals. They created an interesting and culturally or creative space, and ran successful weekly market, which started getting people into the space, which enabled them to create enough animation to get funding, and then also to redevelop some of these homes on a very, very low scale basis. So this is on a house by house basis rather than a large scale master plan. So when you're thinking about how do you make change, sometimes it's not mandated, it's not big, sometimes it's very small scale. Okay, so I'm going to broadly finish with the life of a social movement and what that looks like. And I think effectively what we've started seeing, looking at all of these different kinds of case studies, and as I say, they are massively diverse, is that there is a pretty obvious change model or change curve, if you like. And emergence is the hardest bit, getting it off the ground. It's like any, no marketing strategist often marketing people will come to you and say, I've got this great idea, let's just make it go viral. Well, you can't just mandate something going viral. It has to be compelling and capture the imagination of a community. So I think I want us to think about this when we're thinking about how this might be applied to the framework. What are the kinds of things that we're trying to think about for communities to make for some of the changes you're looking for the framework. Because the steepest climb is between the idea and commitment to action. So this is where everything fails. So I think you had talked about let's redesign the bathroom, which is a great idea. I think all innovations are often very good ideas. It's the ideas to application that is the hardest bit, you know, to say, how do we actually make that change? So the commitment to action, sustaining momentum, and then crucially, when you either shift the system so much that you replace it, or you integrate it into the existing system, or you fail. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with failing. Failing is an important part of learning, but there are sort of only three real ways. You either upturn the system, you integrate into the system, or you fail to achieve what you'd set out to do. So I'm going to finish this presentation on just a couple of key ideas. I think we're seeing in our study that, as I say, there are different models of change. There is the change by design, the hierarchical model. There is the individual incentives and behaviour change. But in the middle is this really crucial bit, which is social movements. And so success for social movements is that they are instrumental to changing the path of a society. When a group of people comes together with a shared idea, they can create lasting effects by encouraging change in their society or by resisting it, both of which shape the future. A successful social movement eventually gets absorbed into the existing institutions when it has achieved desired changes. This is why I'm really fascinated by how tech does this. How is some of this massive creative destruction that's coming with new tech going to really be bedded into institutions? So it's existing institutions when it has achieved its desired changes. Our entire culture and society is formed from past social movements, vegetarianism, and both those that have succeeded and those that have failed. So I want to thank you for listening to that, and then we're going to have a cup of tea, and then we're going to talk about it.